Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome to another daily movie review. Today, we got another documentary for you. Today, we're going to be talking about the 2020 film recently released, Feels Good, Man, directed by Arthur Jones. The logline plot synopsis is artist Matt Fury, creator of the comic character Pepe the Frog, begins an uphill battle to take back his iconic cartoon image from those who used it for their own purposes. So, yeah, you know who Pepe is. You know what happened with Pepe. Well, this would give you kind of an origin story for Pepe, and then an origin story for how he was basically turned into a big old internet meme. From the most benign things to watching Pepe put people in concentration camps and put them in ovens while dressed like a Nazi. You've seen them all. Uh, so yeah, this is actually, I kind of knew a lot about this already going into this documentary. It's a decent primer. I'd say the first half of the documentary was the most interesting because I actually learned a lot about kind of just the artist who created him, Matt Fury, and the character itself and where he comes from. I never really investigated very deeply into anything about Pepe. I just knew him as the meme, in all different facets. Like Pepe, for most of the time Pepe existed or has existed, he's not really like an alt-right thing. He was definitely like a 4chan, a message board, a Twitter troll thing, kind of in the same way that Wojak is. If you go back a few months ago, Dan and I, my brother Dan and I, we talked about TFW no GF, which is about kind of like Twitter trolls and message board 4chan guys and incels and that kind of online culture and how those guys feel. Well, this is a part of that. This is kind of a part of that broader story. And now that documentary is really like fly on the wall. It's very rough around the edges, but ultimately kind of interesting. I don't think it nails it, but it's definitely interesting. Here, this is a much more slick presentation. This is more, for lack of a better way to put it, is more propagandistic. It feels like propaganda to a certain degree. And I don't think that's the intention on the artist, Matt Fury's part. I think that's just something they decided to do in post, or maybe they're not even aware that they're doing it, because it doesn't, it paints obviously a pretty negative, unsympathetic picture of some of these guys, the 4chan guys or the Twitter trolls, whatever you want to call them. I guess just trolls. I suppose they wouldn't be like relegated to Twitter. But it kind of wants to have its cake and eat it too with those guys, because they're like, well, we're gonna have somebody come and explain it. We're going to show you that he's gross and that he's kind of amoral and unsympathetic and almost like, I would say, a form of autism probably. And it just kind of gives him like the room to talk most of the time. He's really the representative of that era, and he's able to break it down pretty well in terms of like emotionally what memes meant to these guys and how Pepe kind of fit into that meme world, into the message board world. And then he gives a little bit of insight into the nature of trolls, the nature of one-upsmanship that happens on these message boards, where they're like kind of trying to out offend each other to be whoever can have the most outlandish thing. So it's the kind of this gamification of being on a message board, in the same way that something like Reddit works, right? With the upvoting and the downvoting. It's the same type of system. And it just promotes a lot of outlandish, crazy shit. The most offensive thing will make it to the top. It doesn't mean those people like mean those things, but I suppose some of them do. And I suppose some of them after a while maybe even start believing their own bullshit. But I think that, honestly, I think for most of those people, it is a game. I don't think you can really talk to them and get really a genuine answer out of them. That's just not in their nature. It's just not who they are. And they're never going to be straight with you. Even when they're explaining the nature of their own communities, they're not going to be straight with a reporter. And you have these people that are kind of these investigative reporters that came in like way late and then tried to figure out what this culture was, what this subculture was, but they have no idea how to really historically kind of track it back far enough to really even understand it. They understand how it works, and even then they kind of just have to impose this weird like normie morality, I guess is the only way I can put it. Like just the worldview of a normie. If you know what that means, you know what it means. And I think the movie while it's very informative and interesting, even, I think it's the journey of Matt Fury as an artist and what he went through and building the character and his whole thing. That's kind of interesting for the first like 45 minutes or so, and then it just goes into this whole thing where it just hyper focuses on the alt right using Pepe. Because I mean, it got adopted. You got like Richard Spencer's telling people to use Pepe as kind of a recruitment tool, the thing to like steal it, so that like people that use it will be associated with it. They'll be associated with your community, like normalize this community, this alt-right notion, which is another thing that I believe he stole. I don't think he coined the term, but I think he stole the term. I could be wrong. I don't know, because I remember when all that was happening back then, it was probably when I was just getting into like kind of being online again, like a lot, because I went for years without like a computer or anything, so I just wasn't a very online person for years. And it was around that time, like I just started getting reintroduced to that stuff, and I remember it just being such a nebulous thing. Like nobody really knew what it was, and then people came out to try to define it, but then it would kind of get trumped because the media wants to just pay attention to the most salacious characters using it. So they kind of got to steal it away, I think, from a more kind of moderate centrist crowd. People that weren't left leaning, they were, but they were not completely like right wing, kind of the modern right, I suppose, the kind of the right leaning person that's okay with gay marriage, that kind of thing. That's kind of how it started. That was more like libertarian in nature, but they weren't quite libertarians, which there's still no name for people like that. I probably fall into that in some respect, where I have like libertarian leanings, left leanings, right leanings. Like I'm all over. I'm a man without a country when it comes to politics. It kind of sucks. It sucks for conversation. It's just hard to talk to people when you're just like, well, I'm kind of all over the place. Yeah. So, but they hyper focus on like this very small minority. That's the thing. Like the media has given so much power and attention to these guys. They make their shit real. It's called like meme magic. They turn it into a real thing. They manifest it into the world by giving it as much attention as they do, because they need a narrative. They need a boogeyman. So that's what they do. They go to these communities and they prop these people up like they're to be taken seriously when they're just shit posters. And if you had just left them alone, they would have stayed there. That's the thing. It's like this problem. It's like, what is it? Problem creation, then solution. Like you just like create a problem and then provide the solution to it. That is basically what the media did with things, even like Pepe. And I don't think the documentary is very open and honest about that. I think it is reflexive in the same way that the media figures are reflexive. When you have like these mid-20s kind of overeducated, upper middle class kind of white nerdy bloggers that just kind of seem like they're almost taking out some sort of weird cultural frustration out on this like really kind of tiny group of people. I'm not saying those people couldn't even ever have an effect, but they would not have as large of an effect if it was not for the attention they were given. I mean, that was never going to get out of the bottle if they didn't allow it to. But I suppose maybe it's an inevitability. I don't know. But yeah, it's just not. It seems like a weird, disingenuous, like kind of direction to go with it, because it seems so thoughtful. And it seems so understanding for like the first 45 minutes. And then the second half is just it's just backloaded with kind of like, you feel like propaganda. Because then they're talking about like Hillary Clinton, her role, and like exposing Pepe and exposing these white nationalists. It's just like, shit, that's not what happened. It's like this weird rewriting of history, and to credit Hillary Clinton with anything, it kind of almost like try to retcons and like have her retake the deplorables comment, the thing that like people just, well, it's beyond the pale. I mean, people are very sensitive, How could she say that about half of the possible voters of the country? Blah. But it definitely did not play out the way that they edited it to play out. Like the sequence of events. I mean, that was when her campaign, she was getting a little worried. She was a little flailing a little bit. I think even though she was still shocked that she lost, I do think she understood that she was in a tighter race than she thought she was in. She thought that would be like a slam dunk. But I don't know. But the media, it's just like it's a creation of the media. And I don't understand how people don't, even still to this day, kind of don't understand or appreciate that. Like, it is a real phenomenon for sure, but it did not have the legs. It didn't. It really didn't. It wasn't until I remember when all this stuff started. This kind of starts in earnest in like 2012. Like, that's when all this stuff kind of starts percolating. The storm off the coast starts forming. It was around, was it like it's so weird, but it's like Anita Sarkeesian. Feminist Frequency is like the lightning rod for all this cultural stuff to start. It starts with fucking video games and people feeling insecure about video games and about what was going on. I remember even back in the day, I think I might have even talked about Feminist Frequency probably a couple times. I think me and my wife did. My now wife. At the time, she was my girlfriend. But we talked about it and just like kind of the weird reflexive nature of it and how it was kind of disingenuous and how it was kind of ruining writing and ruining criticism by being kind of hyper focused on what you want something to be rather than what it is, and kind of reading too much into things and damning things unfairly and expecting everything to conform to like a modern social moray, even things that are old. That's something we still deal with today. Like, look what's going on with people's notions of history. You know, people are judging historical figures by how we live today. What? It's so weird. And it's kind of similar in a sense to what happened with all like 4chan and the people in there, is that like you had this group of people that covered it that didn't really understand it, for better or worse, didn't understand it, and projected their own mores, their own biases, their own desires for what they wanted it to be, what they thought it was, because of their own position. They didn't go in there with kind of open arms trying to really understand the types of people. It just, I mean, the idea that we like go after kind of autistic like virgins as a sport, almost like teenagers for the most part too, instead of like reaching out and trying to help these people, trying to help these kids, it's to fucking blast them on national news and destroy their lives. Like, that's what we do. That's really great. I mean, you should really pat yourselves on the back there. Like, online culture, online activism, especially as it exists on message boards and Twitter. I've had a recent run-in myself. It is a complete waste of time. It is completely just this reflexive, self-congratulatory nonsense where these people just talk to each other and tell each other how much they care about one another. It's just like it's another tribe thing. They found a tribe. And they get to feel virtuous because they associate themselves with something that is virtuous. Whether or not they actually engage in that activity or whatever, they think just like typing the words like #MeToo makes them a good person. That is enough for them. And I feel like a lot of that culture has intersect with what we're talking about and Feels Good Man. With the meme culture and the message board culture, like, and the kind of the people that have made it a crusade to try to take it down, but by doing so have just like kind of actually created it and made it worse. That's, in my opinion. I mean, are you going to find crazies in that community? And on those, of course you are. Do you not find crazies fucking everywhere? Go to look at any hashtag movement. Go look at Justice for Johnny Depp. There's some fucking insane people in there. There's some crazies in there, man. And they want to kill you. Or at least ruin you, or like try to ruin your reputation, or try to find something about you that they can take out of context and try to gaslight you. That's what they do. While shielding themselves, saying like, hey man, you shouldn't have said our behavior was inappropriate. It's fucking bizarre. And they're all part and parcel. It's all part of the same, cut from the same cloth. It's just people have just found different places to do it. So you have like the extreme side where you have like the more trollish, lonely dudes or whatever on 4chan, at least they were. And now you've got like the opposite end of the spectrum, but kind of the same mentality type people, and they're on Twitter. And they're fucking crazy, a lot of them. Sorry, that's what they are. They have no self-awareness, complete cognitive dissonance between the things they say, what they say they stand for, and what and what they're doing. They just can't recognize it. It's very, very intense sometimes. And, you know, it's just, I don't think this documentary actually does a good job kind of even getting into that stuff, really. And it just kind of is, hyper focuses on this stuff and then just kind of doesn't like provide a solution or anything. It just says like, man, isn't that wrong? Isn't it wrong to make jokes like that? Can you believe what they did to Pepe? This poor Matt Fury. Actually, I do feel, if I feel bad for anybody, it's I feel bad for Matt Fury. I do. Sincerely, too. He had no idea what the fuck was going to happen with Pepe the Frog. No clue. And the movie doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't have like a good ending. So what they did was Matt Fury took Alex Jones to court, the humble water filter salesman from Austin, Texas. He takes him to court for, copyright use infringement because Pepe ends up on a poster that InfoWars sold. And, so they're trying to make the fair use case. That's what that was their case. They end up settling out of court anyways. And he pays Matt Fury a bunch of money. And that's the big win. Like, nothing happens with the character. Like, he does this thing where he has a funeral for Pepe. Nobody gave a fuck. I remember when that happened. Nobody gave a fuck. Still nobody gives a fuck. And then he wins. He wins this case against InfoWars. And they use that as kind of the framing device to give him something that, like, positive happened with this movement. It's almost like they made this documentary like a couple years too early, to be honest with you. So they didn't have a broad enough perspective on, like, actually what happened and what the fallout ultimately was going to be. And it's too bad because there was an interesting conversation I think they could have had on the back end of this documentary about Pepe's funeral, about what Matt Fury did. Because then there's a conversation about kind of like cultural ownership of art. Who owns it once it's out there? Is it the creators anymore? Or is it the people that consume it? There's an interesting documentary, not my favorite documentary, but it makes some interesting arguments, is with The People versus George Lucas, and which basically talks about that very concept. There's a whole documentary about that. I don't think the documentary maybe doesn't give you an answer, but it does explore that from different kind of points of view and perspectives. Trigger warning, bunch of gross Star Wars fanboys in there. Probably the terroristic elements that you will find on 4chan. They're probably in that documentary. Oh my God. Connection made. Careful, everybody. Don't watch that film. You'll be radicalized. Feels Good Man, you might also be radicalized. Because, how are you supposed to know? Maybe you watch this documentary and you find out you're a Nazi. Maybe they tell you because, like, hey, man, were you ever here? Sorry, dude. You're a Nazi, bro. That's it's an interesting thing about kind of just anonymous online culture and the message boards and stuff is like, everybody kind of gets lumped in the same way because there are some actual real, probably dangerous people lurking in there. Also some weird adults in there, probably like grooming kids to be weird. Going in there, these MGTOW guys, men going their own way, those fellas. Going in there and just poisoning the minds of young dudes. It's like, that to me is really gross and upsetting. And I do know that stuff, it definitely exists there. Those kids don't even have a fucking chance. Where are their parents? Why aren't their parents involved in their life when they're this young? I suppose when they're in their 20s, ain't much you're going to be able to do, I suppose, in changing something in that kind of perspective. You can't like look over their shoulder every moment of every day, but talk to your kids, man. Fucking find out what's going on. It's your duty. It's your duty, sir. Yeah. I mean, I would say it's worth a watch, especially if you're kind of familiar already with a little bit of it, but just know that the second half is a little hacky. I feel like there was some interesting stuff to be explored, and it kind of just wants to glom onto the narrative that if you're aware of this stuff, you already know. It is basically a way to make that the official story of how things happened and how these things work. I don't know. I did not buy it all completely myself. I do think, especially when you could tell there's things I knew, specific things that happened, specific like story elements that they're using. I was like, that's not how that fucking happened. So I could when I was aware of that, I was like, oh shit, like so this whole thing, a lot of this is probably a little skewed in a certain direction. You know what I'm saying? All right, everybody, that's going to do it for me today. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to know more about Zoobox, bunch of links in the description for Facebook, for Instagram, for my personal Twitter, for Dan's Twitter. Also, if you'd like to make a recommendation for a video, throw it in the comments. We'll check it out. You have the best one ever.